Good evening. My name is Turner Bitton. I'm the executive director here at Westview Media. Thank you for tuning in to the next event in our series of Candid Candidates events. Tonight, we're joined by Representative Angela Romero, who represents House District 26. Welcome, Representative Romero.
Thanks for having me, Turner.
We're so glad you've joined us. For those who are watching live, this is being live streamed on Facebook. We invite you to submit your questions in the chat, and I'll be sure to ask them. But to get started, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and kind of how you ended up in the legislature?
Okay, background. So I'm originally from Tooele, Utah. My grandparents moved to Tooele my grandfather got a job at the Tooele Army Depot. My family is originally from New Mexico, and I always give that narrative and that history because people always want to tie me to another country. So my family has been in what we call the United States prior to 1848 in the Treaty of Guadalupe. I had the spirit and the tenacity to really represent the views of communities of color and underserved communities of the legislature. And so when the time came when David decided to not seek re-election, I had to make a decision. Did I want to run for office or did I not want to run for office? And I had a challenging race because what had happened was redistricting. And so former Representative Livak's district got combined with, at the time, Representative Doty, who replaced Jackie Biskuski when she decided to leave office. And so I had an intra-party race, and it was a tough race because people weren't sure who they wanted to select. Did they select somebody who knew the neighborhood, who knew Glendale well, and majority of the district is West Side? Or did they keep someone who had been appointed by the delegates and lose the only gay representative up at the legislature? So that was a really tough decision on whether I wanted to run or not. But I decided to because I knew the communities, and I represented a lot of diversity as well. I represented a lot of voices that weren't there. And so I won my intra-party race at convention, and then I went on to the general, and I had a Latino opponent from the Republican Party. And that's when I won, and I went up to the Capitol to represent House District 26, which is Glendale and the eastern part of Salt Lake City. So I represent the Central 9th and Central City, parts of downtown, and I also go all the way to Magna.
Thank you. So in your opinion, what is the most important role that the state legislature plays? I know that there are many, but what one have you really embraced or found most important?
What I found most important, and I know my colleagues, Representative Hollins and Senator Escamilla, would also say the same thing, is represent our communities. Especially, again, I represent both sides of Salt Lake City, but I want to make sure that the West Side is not forgotten in policy at a local and state level. And so my first priority is always representing the voice that often isn't heard up there. A lot of what I do is education, not only running legislation, but educating people, listening to people, letting them know that maybe how they're referring to a particular community is a stereotype or might be perceived as racist, but it's having those honest conversations with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and my colleagues on my side of the aisle, as well as finding opportunities to make sure that all voices are heard.
Thank you. So to jump around just a little bit, we had a question submitted in advance, and to paraphrase that, the person, her name was Renee, and she mentioned that she was inspired to see elected officials of color really leading out on the COVID-19 response. And she referenced the work that you and Representative Wheatley and Hollins have been doing. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of discuss what it's been like to represent the West Side and maybe what you've learned during COVID-19 and how you've responded.
I think COVID-19 took a personal impact for me because as many people know, Senator Escamilla and I are very close, and we would carpool up to the legislature. And she was one of the first cases in Utah to contract COVID. And so I personally saw how it impacted her, but at the same time, she recognized that she had certain privileges, and I knew I had certain privileges. And we were concerned about the people we represent because there are many people who are essential workers who live in our district. There are many people who have particular health issues on our district, and a lot of that is based on the dirty air, because the air is not the same in Salt Lake City. The air is dirtier here on the west side because of industry. And so represent community organizing. And so Pete decided he wanted to run for the House of Representatives for House District 23, which is now Sandra Holland's district. And he won. And so he asked me to be his intern. So I interned up at the Utah State Legislature in 1994 for Pete. And that kind of guided my career into policy and public policy. I was privileged enough to work for Mayor Rocky Anderson. I served in his office. And I currently still work for Salt Lake City Corporation. I've been with the city 19 years, and I work with the Division of Youth and Family Programs. And so most of what I do, most of my work has always been surrounded and based on community. And that kind of led me to the legislature. Well, it did lead me to the legislature.
Thank you. So what first convinced you to run for office, or how did you make that initial decision? I believe you were first elected in 2012, right?
Yes. I was groomed to run for office by the late Senator Pete Suazo and Archie Archuleta and David Livack, who I replaced. And so I was groomed by these men who saw something in me, who felt like I had the spirit and the tenacity to really represent the views of communities of color and underserved communities of the legislature. And so when the time came when David decided to not seek re-election, I had to make a decision. Did I want to run for office or did I not want to run for office? And I had a challenging race because what had happened was redistricting. And so former Representative Livack's district got combined with, at the time, Representative Doty, who replaced Jackie Biskuski when she decided to leave office. And so I had an intra-party race, and it was a tough race because people weren't sure who they wanted to select. Did they select somebody who knew the neighborhood, who knew Glendale well, and majority of the district is West Side? Or did they keep someone who had been appointed by the delegates and lose the only gay representative up at the legislature? So that was a really tough decision on whether I wanted to run or not. But I decided to because I knew the communities, and I represented a lot of diversity as well. I represented a lot of voices that weren't there. And so I won my intra-party race at convention, and then I went on to the general, and I had a Latino opponent for the Republican Party, and that's when I won, and I went up to the Capitol to represent House District 26, which is Glendale and the eastern part of Salt Lake City. So I represent the Central 9th and Central City, parts of downtown, and I also go all the way to Magna.
Thank you. So in your opinion, what is the most important role that the state legislature plays? I know that there are many, but what one have you really embraced or found most important?
What I found most important, and I know my colleagues, Representative Hollins and Senator Escamilla, would also say the same thing, is represent our communities. Especially, again, I represent both sides of Salt Lake City, but I want to make sure that the West Side is not forgotten in policy at a local and state level. And so my first priority is always representing the voice that often isn't heard up there. A lot of what I do is education, not only running legislation, but educating people, listening to people, letting them know that maybe how they're referring to a particular community is a stereotype or might be perceived as racist, but it's having those honest conversations with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and my colleagues on my side of the aisle, as well as finding opportunities to make sure that all voices are heard.
Thank you. So to jump around just a little bit, we had a question submitted in advance, and to paraphrase that, the person, her name was Renee, and she mentioned that she was inspired to see elected officials of color really leading out on the COVID-19 response. And she referenced the work that you and Representative Wheatley and Hollins have been doing. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of discuss what it's been like to represent the West Side and maybe what you've learned during COVID-19 and how you've responded.
I think COVID-19 took a personal impact for me because, as many people know, Senator Escamilla and I are very close, and we would carpool up to the legislature. And she was one of the first cases in Utah to contract COVID. And so I personally saw how it impacted her, but at the same time, she recognized that she had certain privileges, and I knew I had certain privileges. And we were concerned about the people we represent because there are many people who are essential workers who live in our district. There are many people who have particular health issues on our district, and a lot of that is based on the dirty air, because the air is not the same in Salt Lake City. The air is dirtier here on the west side because of industry. And so Representative Senator Escamilla and I decided to seek CARES Act funding so that we could start the COVID community partnership. We were able to work with Representative Schultz and Senator Jerry Stevenson, and we were able to secure $230,000 in CARES Act funding to start the COVID community partnership. And that program is run through the Office of Health and Disparities. And we work with local nonprofits that are from communities of color, and they go and educate people about what resources there are available for them should they contract COVID-19. And then we also have a partnership with Salt Lake County and Salt Lake City, and Salt Lake County provides food boxes for families. And so we really felt like it was an important need that wasn't being served. Again, we have a lot of privileges. We depend on people who are essential workers. And that's one of the reasons why I love living on the West Side, because not only are we ethnically, racially diverse, but everyone is just so inclusive regardless of who you are. And we're a neighborhood, we stick together. And so we wanted to make sure that we were truly representing our constituents by doing that. The COVID community partnership expanded to the entire state of Utah. So we were able to secure another, I think it was $1.2 million in CARES Act funding to expand the program so that we were reaching some of our most vulnerable across the state.
Thank you. So turning a little bit more toward legislation, you've kind of carved out a niche for yourself, working on issues of domestic violence, sexual violence, and interpersonal violence. And one of the first questions I'd like to ask, there have been some headlines recently about a commission that you sponsored legislation to create, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk about that.
Yeah, so we were finally able to appoint all our members to the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Task Force. I was approached by Moroni Benelli, who's also a Glendale resident, and Yolanda Francisco Nez, who I'd worked with in the Salt Lake City Mayor's office. They run a nonprofit called RAW, which is Restoring Ancestral Winds. And their focus is on Native American and Indigenous communities and sexual assault. So in 2019, we passed a resolution called the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Two-Spirited Resolution. So this was the first time that I can remember that we had LGBTQ+ in the title of a bill at the Utah State Legislature, and it passed. And so what that did is it honors murdered and missing Indigenous women and two-spirited individuals. And it's on May 5th, which is a national honoring and talking about this epidemic that we have in our country. So I knew that if we were able to pass the resolution, we would be able to pass the task force. So this last session, we passed I ran HB 119, 116. Oh, my bills all get kind of in my head. And we were able to successfully pass the task force, and we recently appointed the final members. And what is unique about our task force is that all the community appointments are Indigenous, and they represent our different tribal communities. And that was really important to me, because a lot of times we as elected officials, we are there talking about issues that impact people, but we never have the people that it impacts at the table. And so I was really committed in ensuring that we had the people who it directly impact be part of the process, which is what's going to take place now. I'll probably have to run another bill to extend the report that we're looking at and look at the policy pieces that we need to look at, just due to the fact that the task force got appointed too late.
Yep. Thank you. I'm going to give you a break for just a second because I've hit you with a bunch of questions in a row. And just remind folks that are watching the live stream to submit questions if you have them, and we'll be sure to ask them. kind of in a similar vein, I'd like to talk about the different bills you've run related to victim advocacy. And I know that there have been many, but are there any that stick out as a proudest accomplishment for you, or that you'd like to talk about at more length?
I think probably my first major bill was HB 286, which was child sex abuse preventative education. And you think by that title it would be easy to pass. And when I told my colleagues on my side of the aisle, I'm like, I'm going to run this bill on child sex abuse to do preventive education in the schools, and they're like, good luck. And I was like, why? They're like, you're going to have a tough time. And it was a struggle. And what was really unique about this bill is that it brought people into my life like Elizabeth Smart and Deandra Brown, and I are still very close. And we had to advocate till the last day, and it was an uphill battle, but we were able to pass the bill. So now we can provide preventative child sex abuse education in the schools, because I think when we think about child sex abuse, or we think about sexual assault in general and involving children, people think it's someone that you don't know. But most children that experience child sex abuse experience it by someone in their circle of trust. And so we really wanted to educate individuals. And in Utah, we have a higher rate of child sex abuse than in other places in the United States of America. So it was really, really important to me that we passed that bill. But I think the highlight of my legislative career, and I can walk away from this and feel good about myself and feel like proud of what I was able to accomplish, was HB 200. And so that was mandating the testing of all sexual assault kits. We just recently had a press conference. Utah is the 8th state to get rid of their backlog. So we no longer have a backlog here in Utah. But the really important part of HB 200 was not just mandating the sexual assault kits. It was allowing victims to be able to track their sexual assault kit, but also provide training for law enforcement to be more victim-centric. Because even though we passed that bill, there are so many people who have been sexually violated or sexually assaulted, and they don't share it. They don't tell people what happened to them. They don't get the kit. So that was a step for survivors that were willing to, for whatever purpose, get that sexual assault kit, but now they know that justice has been served for them. But it brings the question to a larger conversation, which is we need to be talking about healthy relationships, and we need to be doing that in our schools, and we need to be talking about consent. And so that's something I'll be focusing on this session, is really focusing on consent and before I leave the legislature, hopefully having more of a affirmative consent here in our state as on our books than we currently have. I was able to at least provide the definition this last session with one of my bills, but moving forward, I want to be a little bit more detailed and ensure that we're providing all the measures we need to be, because right now with our current administration at a federal level, we've seen attacks on Title IX. And so I want to make sure that we're providing the resources that we need to at a university level, as well as in our schools, but just in general. And so moving forward, that's kind of going to be my focus again this session, along with some other legislation involving sexual assault and addressing sexual assault.
Thank you. So as I was looking at your legislative record on the website, I noticed that one of the first committees that you were appointed to was the Public Utilities Commission.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to ask if that was something that you had sought, or if that was kind of an accidental appointment, or kind of how that came about.
No, that was because I was a freshman legislator with no seniority. When I was elected in 2012, and my first session was 2013, I was the only Democrat elected to the House of Representatives, and I was one of 2 women. And so the process happens when you get elected, whether based on your political party, you caucus with them. And since I was the newcomer, I had last choice on the committees I was assigned to. So I got put on public utilities, but actually I'm glad I was assigned to public utilities. It took me my first session to understand the terminology and what I was talking about, but public utilities it's something we just take for granted. We just flip on the light and we think we're okay. And so I've learned a lot from that. And we were able to pass some really progressive legislation 2 sessions ago with Steve Handy when it comes to Rocky Mountain Power and how we're going to get to net zero here in Salt Lake City. And so that committee has an important role too. And, you know, it was my second session. I convinced the chair to let me do a whole presentation on renewable energy because we were talking about energy, but we never talked about renewable energy. So I bugged him and I bugged him and I texted him and I emailed him. And he's like, fine, I'll give you an hour and a half to do your presentation. And so it was kind of the first time we started talking about how do we diversify our energy portfolio. And so it's been an interesting committee to serve on, and I've learned a lot on that committee.
Thank you. Another thing that I noticed as I was looking at different information to prepare for this, you're listed as one of the more progressive members of the state legislature, and then you're also listed as one of the most effective in terms of number of bills passed based on your tenure. And I just wanted to ask, what is your secret to success, and kind of how do you operate as a Democrat up on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, our minority leader calls me the Republican whisper. And I really base it on my small town values and the way I was raised. So my grandparents came from a very small town. I grew up in a small town. Tola was a small town at one time, but they grew up in the mountains in northern New Mexico. And so everything was based on your word, and everything was based on respect for others. And even if you disagreed, you always gave individuals respect. And so one of the first things I did when I went up to the Capitol, when I served my first term, is I ran 2 bills. I don't even think I passed a bill my first session. I might have passed 1 bill, but I took the opportunity to get to know my colleagues. And at times I identified more with some of my Republican colleagues than I did with my fellow Democrats. Nothing against my fellow Democrats, but we had a lot more in common because I was, I think, 38 when I was first in the legislature. And the gentlemen I came in with were around my same age range. And so there were a lot of commonalities growing up in a small town. And of course, there was a lot of differences. And I think the reason why I've been so successful is because of those relationships I cultivated. Do I agree with them all the time? No way, not all the time. But I still always give them respect, and I expect them to give me the same respect in return. Because I'm usually rated one of the most progressive, and it's easy to talk a good talk and do politics and yell at people and talk about them on social media, or you can do my approach, which is focus on the policy and get to know that person and identify why they support your bill or why they don't support your bill, and have a conversation. So majority of the legislation I run, the conversations happen off of the floor. The conversations happen before committee. And I just try to get to know people and ask them why they support or they don't support my bill. And I think that's been very effective because as a Democrat in Utah, there's only 16 of us in the House of Representatives currently of a body of 75. If I don't have a relationship with my colleagues, I'm not able to pass the legislation I want to. And so I put my ego aside and I focus on the issues that I care about, which are sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking. And because I've focused on those areas, we're now having conversations. When I passed that child sex abuse bill in 2014, it opened the door to have conversations about sexual assault, because my colleague before me, a fellow West Sider, Representative Jennifer Seelig, former Representative Seelig, started these conversations and I've kind of finished them. And then somebody will come after me and expand them even more. And so we open the door to have these conversations about issues that impact all of us. All of us are related to somebody who's been a victim of child sex abuse or sexual assault. We may not know it, but we are. And so I wanted to make sure we were humanizing those issues and having those uncomfortable conversations. And I'll continue to do that up there.
Thank you. I think this is a good segue to the next series of questions that we had. We had a woman, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, but I believe it's Samu, who asked, what is your advice for women of color who are interested in getting involved in elected politics?
It's run. I mean, it's run, and you might have a different leadership style than others do, and don't let anyone tell you that the way you lead is the wrong way. And so if they're really interested in running, contact me. I'm not going to be there forever. And if someone's really interested in running, get to know me, and I can show you around. I can take you up to the Capitol and introduce you to what I do up there. But also get involved in your community. I think why I was able to win my race, my intra-party race, so handedly is because at the time I was working at the Sorensen Unity Center. I did Zumba with all the neighborhood women. I also taught religious education at St. Patrick's. I worked with a group of young men who I think I did 3 years with them. So I went with them. And so I knew the people that I was trying to represent. And so I think it's so important if people want to run for office is to get to know the communities that you're trying to represent. Because a lot of times people just want to run for office to run for office. And they don't know that they want to serve. But it's so important if you're going to represent a community, find out who your constituents are, get involved, and so that you're really representing that voice. And so I would encourage her just to get involved in different, she can private message me on Facebook, and I can definitely connect her to some organizations, or she can shadow me this session if we're out of this pandemic and we're able to go up there and have guests.
Thank you. I'm going to give you a break for just a second because we just covered a lot of questions, and just remind folks that are watching live, if you have questions, please submit them. I haven't seen any come in, so if you're sitting on one, make sure that you submit it in the live chat, and we'll get to it. The next thing that I kind of want to turn to is back toward the campaign. I know that you're running, I believe, unopposed for your race, but one of the things I appreciate is that you're still willing to campaign.
Yeah. And I still get nervous. See, my neck's a little red right there.
Well, I'd like to ask what you think in your race the biggest issue for voters is, and maybe if it's not specifically in your race, what do you think is the biggest issue in general right now?
I think people just feel hopeless right now, and this is kind of the conversations I've been having with people. They feel like partisan politics takes place of actual having conversation and dialogue. People are concerned about whether they're going to be able to pay their rent, what's going to happen after the pandemic, and how do we move forward, because that's a major concern for me. But for me, and again, I'm Democrat, what's more frightening is the death of RBG and what's going to happen when we appoint our next Supreme Court justice, but also when it comes to police reform, when it comes to systemic racism. You know, everyone's focused on police reform, and as we should be, but there are other underlining issues outside of police reform that we have to focus on. I think why I focus so strongly on COVID-19 is Senator Escamilla, Representative Hollins, and all the other Quad Caucus members, the members that are up at the legislature that are from communities of color or ethnicity or race, because there's a difference between ethnicity and race. What our concerns were is that COVID-19, we were talking about this pandemic and what's going on, but what it did is it just really shined a light on some issues that were already there, these systemic issues. Like what it talked about is access to healthcare. There are a lot of children in my district who qualify for CHIP, but they're not enrolled, and a lot of it has to do with just the paperwork and everything you have to do. I know my son had a Medicaid card for a while I was going to school, and just the paperwork, everything that it's just exhausting. But also we have a lot of families in Glendale and across the West Side who are mixed status. There's certain members who have citizenship. There's certain members that are aspiring to be citizens. And so they're afraid, they don't trust government, and I don't blame them. And so for me, my biggest issue and my biggest thing moving forward is, how do we make sure people feel like they can trust their government? How do we make sure people can trust their government officials? Because 2 years ago, we voted on ballot initiatives, and then my colleagues changed those. And so how do people feel like why should people even vote? And so I just don't want people to give up hope. And so my goal, and I know Representative Hollins and Senator Escamilla and all my colleagues, we're really trying to get out there to make sure people know that their vote matters and we care. If all the people would have voted Democrat, that voted for the initiatives, we wouldn't have 16 members. We probably could have had 22 members. And so it's so important for people to get involved at a local level. And, you know, there's some people that just don't want to vote, and that's their choice. But a lot of times why people don't want to vote is because there are so many obstacles put in their way when it comes to voter suppression. And this is something that's always bothered me sometimes, is people try to compare districts, and we can't compare districts. There are some districts that they have huge voter turnout, but again, there's a lot of privilege there. And so we have to really talk about the elephant in the room, and it's not the Republicans, it's systemic racism. It's all these intersectionalities and how we still don't have equity. And so until we really focus on equity, we're going to see these injustices still exist. And so I talked about healthcare, but what about access to a living wage so you don't have to work 2 or 3 jobs? What about access to affordable transportation? Say you want to do mass transit, you know, how can you if you're working 3 or 4 jobs? And then also talking about the air we breathe. Again, on the west side, I chose to live here, but there are many people in our neighborhood who suffer from asthma and have other health conditions, and it's based off of the air we breathe. When all that smoke was in the air, I get really bad sinus headaches and migraines, and so sometimes I can't leave my room. I have to sit there in the dark. So again, it's about, we have to look at this from a systemic lens. And I think we're at a time in our country where we can actually have these conversations. To have the conversations we had during one of our special sessions on police reform, and Representative Hollins being the chief sponsor, banning the knee on the neck. For many people that wasn't enough, but that was a huge accomplishment for us. It was a huge accomplishment for us, but that's because we pushed it. Senator Escamilla, myself, Representative Hollins insisted and went toe to toe with some of our colleagues behind the scenes to make sure that she was the chief sponsor, and that it was a bipartisan effort. And we're still having those tough conversations, and we'll still continue to have those tough conversations. But that's what we're elected to do, is to make sure that our voices aren't left out. Are we always going to get our way? No, but we'll continue to fight.
Thank you. I think this is a good transition to talk about police reform. And you mentioned the special session with the ban on chokeholds. And I just wanted to get, even if it's 10,000-foot view, just your view of everything that's happening right now, and maybe providing just some background or information about what you're working on as it relates to the national conversation.
Yeah, these are conversations that, again, it's really interesting because I get emails and they're like, what are you going to do about police reform? What are you going to do about systemic racism? And I'm like, I live this every day. I wake up every morning and I see a brown woman in the mirror. I know when we look at criminal justice reform, it's personally impacted me. My cousin was the first case here in Utah to be tried under Project Safe Neighborhoods. He got 65 years in federal prison. He will never see the light of day. And so one of the reasons I ran is because I wanted to make sure that we had these different voices up there. So when it comes to police reform, we have a long way to go. But does that mean I'm not going to work with law enforcement? No, I have to work with law enforcement. And that's my role as an elected official. But am I happy people are out there protesting? People are voicing their opinion? Yes, because we need all the different voices so that we can push things forward. Am I going to be able to do things that people want me to do? I don't know. I'm not going to make false promises to people, but I'm going to do my best. But all I know is when me and Representative Hollins were watching the first protest, and we were watching what was happening, and we knew that we had to, as leaders, we had to say something, and we had to also say it's important to peacefully protest. It's important to question current policies when it comes to how law enforcement interacts with our communities. We have our own personal experiences with law enforcement. Does that mean we think everyone who is in law enforcement is bad? No, but there's systems that we have to change. And if we don't change those systems, we're going to continue to have these problems. And so that's why we as elected officials, we're going to sit at the table with everyone, and we're going to have those conversations. And so right now we're working with the Department of Public Safety. We're working with a variety of community organizations. And one thing I want to point out too is not all communities of color are the same. We're not a monolithic community. There are different organizations out there, and they're doing their thing. And it's not my place to tell them how to organize or how to go about doing things. And it's important to know that people have different approaches on how they're going to do things. And it's important that we all work together, because if we're out there attacking each other, we're never going to move forward. And that's just it. So for me, I'm trying to do my best to work with everyone to try to create change. And that's why we formed the Quad Caucus, because we know this. We have personal experiences when it comes to systemic racism. We experience this in our daily lives. And this is not just about Republicans. This is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This is an issue that we all have to look at in the face and say, hey, how have I contributed to this? How do I have certain privileges because of historical trauma and the history of the United States of America? Does that mean that I have to give up everything? No. But does that mean I have to share? Yes. And there are certain things we're going to have to change. And people of color and the majority community, all of us stereotype, all of us have prejudice, all of us do things. So none of us are perfect. We all have to work on this. So when we put it on one community only, then we're lying to ourselves. And I don't care if you're a Democrat, I don't care if you're a Republican, you have work to do. I have work to do all the time. I have to deconstruct things in my head all the time as I move forward. And so as we move forward on police reform, I think there are definitely going to be some changes. There are many bills that have been filed from both Republicans and Democrats. We're kind of working together to figure out how we're going to move forward. There's some things that we want to see. I personally want to see, and I don't know if it'll ever see the light of day when it comes to accountability for law enforcement, but we're still going to push it forward, and we're still going to have those conversations with community and with law enforcement. But it's very touchy, and it's very touch and go right now. I think the biggest thing that we're feeling now as elected officials is due to COVID-19. We've been inundated, this is what I've been doing all day, with emails, people asking us to call a special session, because the legislature can call themselves into special session and terminate the state of emergency. And I'm just looking at these emails and I'm like, I don't agree with you. And sometimes those are tough conversations to have, because a lot of these individuals will say, I'm your constituent. And then I'll find out that they're not my constituent, but I can't back down for what I believe. And I think this is a thing that we do sometimes as elected officials. We dance around an issue and we're not honest with people. And I've just been honest with these individuals. I'm like, no, we need to have the state of emergency. Look at the COVID increases that we've had here in the state of Utah. Yeah, this is going to be painful for a while. Yeah, this is going to hurt us all. But if we don't deal with it now, what's going to happen to us later? And so those are kind of the conversations that we're having. So outside of police reform, we're also having COVID-19. And guess who gets most impacted by it? It's our communities here on the West Side. You know, we've been hotspots. We are the essential workers. We're the reason why people are able to go out and eat. People are able to get groceries. And so those are some of the conversations we'll still continue to have as we move forward. It'll be interesting to see if we have a special session, but police reform is definitely on the top of our agenda. We as the Quad Caucus are making sure we're not going to let that go. All of us have picked a piece of legislation. I know Representative Wheatley is going to try to repeal a bill that Paul Ray ran on citizen boards when it comes to police reform. I know I'm going to run a bill on training. I know a lot of people say training doesn't do anything. Well, it doesn't do anything if we don't change the other pieces to it. And I know Senator Escamilla is going to look at equity as a whole, and not just police reform, but equity as a whole in our community. And how does that impact the school to prison pipeline? How does that impact people's access to healthcare? And so we're really going to tackle these systemic issues.
Thank you. I'm going to give you a break, and we do have 2 questions from the audience, but I'll give you just a second. Just remind folks that are watching to submit questions. I'm running toward the end of my list of prepared questions, so this part of the town hall will depend on you all submitting your questions for Representative Romero. But the first audience question comes from Cindy, and it lines up really well with what we were just talking about. She asked, how do you do your victim advocacy work where you work with law enforcement while also pursuing police reform?
I have honest conversations with the law enforcement individuals that I work with. I work closely with the Department of Public Safety again, and Chief Brian Redd, who has worked with me on the Murder and Missing Indigenous Women Task Force. So he also worked with me on HB 200 and also securing funding for HB 200. Although I passed the bill in 2015, we didn't secure all the funding until this last session. And so it's having those honest conversations. Again, it's like me working with my Republican colleagues. We may not agree on things, and I may not agree on things with law enforcement, but it's taken the time to listen to both sides. And then again, some of these gentlemen and women have I sit on law enforcement, I sit on the committee, and they've had their challenges with me when it comes to talking about the school to prison pipeline. They've had their challenges with me when I talk about diversity training. So they already know where I'm coming from, but they also know how passionate I am about victims' rights, and they play a role in that too. And we clashed on how we identified, how we dealt with women, shouldn't say dealt with, how we worked with someone who had been sexually assaulted or someone that had been a victim of domestic violence. You should not treat them the same way that you're going to treat the alleged perpetrator. And so there's been a lot of backdoor conversations we've had on that in the public as well. But again, it's taken the time to sit down and talk with each other. A lot of times we're talking the same language, we're just using a different dialect. I hate to say it that way, but when people talk about defunding the police, that doesn't mean that I mean, me personally, there are people that believe in abolishing police. I don't. I understand where people are coming from when they say defund the police, because I definitely think we don't spend enough resources in other areas where maybe we wouldn't have to have law enforcement involved, or maybe law enforcement shouldn't be involved. But if you don't have the conversation, then you're never going to find the answer.
Thank you. The next question is along a similar line, dealing with the Missing and Indigenous Women Commission. Brian asked what the difference is between Indigenous and Native American, or do they mean the same thing?
They mean the same thing. Okay. Native, I mean, people use different terminology. Some people identify as Native, some people identify as Indigenous, some people identify as Native American. I don't ever try to put an identity on anyone. I like to ask them how they identify before I just put it on there. But again, when it comes to murder and missing Indigenous women and Two-Spirited, a lot of people think that this is just an issue that happens on the reservation, but majority of our American Indian population, our Indigenous population, lives in an urban setting. And so this is not just an issue that we need to address on the reservation, which there is a gap there too. This is happening in an urban setting as well. And this also ties in with human trafficking. And so this is something that we're working on, because what we're really concerned about is collecting the data, making sure that these individuals, mostly are women, are classified the correct way. And so there are lots of stories. And so the first task force meeting we're gonna have, we need to listen to the stories of individuals who have been impacted, their families, by this epidemic. And so a lot of times as elected officials, we want to solve the answer and we don't take the time to listen. So the first meeting we're going to have is really a listening session. If anyone wants to read a little bit more about this task force, there was an article in the Tribune yesterday that was very effective and in messaging what needs to be done. And it wasn't from my perspective or my Senate sponsor's perspective. It was from our Native community members' perspective. And so I think that was really important. I appreciate the writer talking about the task force, not from my voice, but from the voice of the people who had been directly impacted by it. And I read that story and I'm going to listen to what she had to say. And that's how I want to run that first meeting. Because why are we doing things if we're not listening to the people it directly impacts? And that's the unique thing about us, I would say, us that represent the West Side, is we do listen to our constituents, and sometimes we're in agreement, sometimes we're not, but we're always going to be honest.
Thank you. And for those watching live, I did put the link to that Salt Lake Tribune article in the chat, so feel free to read that. I'm getting toward the end of my questions, and I haven't seen any additional audience ones come in. So I'm going to move on to the second to last question that I have for you, which is there any issue that I should have brought up tonight that I didn't, or any question I should have asked you that I didn't?
You know, there's lots of things we could talk about, but this session really, I think when we talk about the legislature there and what we can do on police reform and what the city can do and what the county can do, and I get a lot of these questions all the time. And so we are the state legislature. We address things at the state level. So a lot of the laws we make impact the way in which the county and the city, it impacts the way the district attorney can do his job. I'm not in a debate about who he is or what he's doing. And it impacts the way Salt Lake City can do their job too. But what people also have to remember is I'm one of 16 in a body of 75. And so in order for me, people are like, well, you have power, you're an elected official. And I'm like, no, not necessarily. I have access to power, but I cannot actually get anything passed or put into law without the support of my colleagues. And so when we're talking about police reform and you look at the people who represent our neighborhoods in Salt Lake City, most of us are going to be on the same page, because majority of the people I hear from want to see some reform, want to make sure that something happens, something changes. But we also have to convince all those other people who represent other parts of the state to agree with the reform we're doing. And so part of that is advocating and lobbying them and saying, this is why I think this bill is so important. This is why I want to see this change. Because if we don't have that support, we're not successful. And you know what's really interesting about Utah, I have colleagues that live across the country who live in red states like we do. We pass more legislation than a lot of my colleagues in other states do. And I think that's, it's unique to Utah, but you know, I'm thankful that we can do that. Does that mean I'm not going to hold my colleagues accountable? No, I'm going to hold them accountable, and we're going to definitely have disagreements. But again, it's the process moves slow. I wish it could move faster than what it does, but it moves slow, and it was designed to move slow. We have the checks and balances. We have the executive branch, which is the governor. We have the legislative branch, which is us. And then we have the judicial branch, which is the courts. And you see that at a city level too. The legislative branch is the city council. The executive branch is the mayor. And then you have the courts to go to deal with issues when it's not resolved in either body there. And so there's a reason why we have those checks and balances. And that's why sometimes things move slower than we want them to move. But at times I've wanted things to happen my way and they don't. But that doesn't mean I don't do an all or nothing approach. When I had the child marriage bill, I mean, my goal was to raise the minimum age of marriage to 18. I didn't accomplish that, but I was willing to compromise because it eliminated 15-year-olds from getting married. And it also put that a 16-year-old couldn't get married without a court consenting as well. Prior to that, it was just a parent. And as Sherry Swenson told me, she had to marry young women to men that she didn't want to, but they had parental permission, so she had to do that. And then it also gave, so if you're 7 years older, if you're trying to marry a 16-year-old, which I don't understand why you would, or a 17-year-old, there can only be a 7-year gap in age. I wanted to make it 5 years, but I had to compromise on 7 years. But so we have those laws in place. And so for me, I feel like, would I eventually want to raise it to 18? Yes, but then we're going to collect the data and see how this has changed things, and we move forward. The other thing I've worked on that I haven't really talked about today is human trafficking. So in 2011, we had an F grade by a national organization, and now we've moved to an A grade. And what started that is Representative Jennifer Seelig, before I tried to pass the Safe Harbor bill, because prior to her bill, anyone under the age of 18 that was picked up for commercial sex was considered a criminal. And so she was able to change that somewhat, and then I was able to expand on that. So after my bill passed, anyone accused of commercial sex who's under the age of 18 is considered a human trafficking victim. And instead of penalizing them, we're directing them to services and trying to get them help. And if I could do anything in the state legislature, if I could do more of, it would be to do preventative services, to provide opportunities for young people who might have been kicked out of their homes because of who they are, to provide those resources so that they can be self-sufficient and they can move forward. Because when you're in a vulnerable situation and you have nowhere to go, sometimes you can be coerced or groomed to do something that you don't want to do. And so when we talk about human trafficking, we're not talking about taken, we're talking about young people that we may know that because of certain circumstances, they've now been coerced to do things they don't want to do. And when we talk about human trafficking, because we're talking about Save the Children now, and we have that hashtag and we have QAnon, it's not always a stranger that's going to snap someone up out of a mall. I mean, does that happen? Yes, but most people who are trafficked by somebody they know, or it's because they're experiencing homelessness and they have no options. So we really need to have these honest conversations. How do we move forward as a state to make sure that people have access to affordable housing, they have access to a livable wage and health care? And if we did all that preventative stuff, and I know people brag about us being the best run state, and maybe in some spaces that's how we're perceived, but we have a long way to go when we're talking about some of the most vulnerable in our community. So I know a lot of people who live in our district who work just as hard as I do, but because of their status or because of their the access they had to education, they don't make the same amount of money I do. And in order to do that, they have to work 2 or 3 jobs in trying to support their family. So we have a long way to go as a state to really take care of all our citizens. And I think that's one of the reasons why I have so much passion and why I serve in the legislature. Although my focus is on sexual assault, domestic violence, and human trafficking, it doesn't mean that these other issues aren't important to me, and making sure that there's a voice for people who are often not heard.
Thank you. The last question I have for you is, what is your website and how can folks find out more information about you?
So my website is just angelaromero.com. They can also just, my Twitter is Rep Angela Romero. My Instagram is Rep Angela Romero, and they can find me on Facebook at Rep Angela Romero. And if they want to get involved, if they want to volunteer, they want to learn more about what I'm doing, that's where they can reach out to me. They can also email me. When it comes to my legislative work, they can email me at angelaromero@le.utah.gov. Or if it's related to my campaign, they can just email me at angela@angelaromero.com. So there's a lot of Angela Romero in there.
Well, thank you. And I'll make sure that I put that all in the chat so that folks have access to it.
Yeah, and I know like right now I'm probably not a hot topic because I don't have an opponent, but I just wanted people to know that I care and that I'm still going to be involved. And just because I don't have an opponent doesn't mean that people shouldn't vote for me or vote for others, because that's why I'm still campaigning and working hard, because I want people to know that I care and I don't take them for granted. But I also know how important it is for me as a Democrat. The more people that go to vote for me, hopefully they're gonna vote up and down the ticket Democrat, and we're gonna find some political balance here, because I don't think there should ever be a supermajority of any political party. And I know some people would even argue saying, well, we need more than 2 political parties, and I don't necessarily disagree with them.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you coming on tonight. I don't have any more audience questions, so I think we'll go ahead and end the live stream.
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.